The water in the basin was still warm when I felt it, a stillness in the baby that had no name in anything I had been taught. Not a sound, not a color, not a thing you could point to and say, there, that is the thing that is wrong. Something that moved through my hands the way cold moves through a wall in winter. It's quiet and certain and already done by the time you notice it. She had cried once when she came out, one thin sound like a door hinge, and then she had simply gone somewhere else, somewhere behind her own face, and her color was right, and her weight was fine, and her mother was watching me from the bed, with the kind of eyes that already know before you say anything, and I did not say anything, because there were no words in the language I had been given for what I was holding. I had caught 389 babies by then. I was 27 years old when I caught the first one, and I was not yet 35 when I held this one, and in those 8 years I had learned the difference between a baby that startles and a baby that does not, between a cry that means hunger and a cry that means something else entirely, and I had also learned what it meant when there was no cry at all, and the baby's heart ran fast and then stumbled and then ran fast again like a horse that cannot find its footing. I had learned it because I had seen it before, twice before, and one of those two I had also buried. What I had not learned, what no one in my community had ever given me language for, was why. Why certain families? Why certain names? Why the same surnames appeared in the kitchen at 2 a.m. with a basin of warm water and a baby that would not cry and a mother who already knew. Stoltzfus, Byler, Zook, I will tell you why now, because I spent 22 years not telling anyone, and the silence cost 4 children their futures and in 3 cases their lives, and the silence was not mine alone to keep. It was handed to me the same way the basin was handed to me, the same way the prayers were handed to me, the same way the answer was always handed to me before I had finished asking the question. The answer was always God's design, God's will. A cross given for a reason, and I believed it. I want you to understand that I believed it completely, the way you believe in the floor beneath your feet. Not because you have tested it, but because you have never had reason to. My name is Barbiana, and I was a midwife in Old Order, Lancaster County for 11 years, and I am telling you this now because the thing that was killing the children I delivered was never God's design. It was mathematics. It was a founder effect, a term I did not hear until I was sitting in a geneticist's office in Philadelphia at 36 years old, with my hands folded in my lap like a woman waiting to be told something she has already been told by her own body for a decade. A founder effect is what happens when a small group separates from a larger population and marries only within itself across generations. The genes that are rare in the wider world, the recessive ones, the ones that need 2 copies to cause harm, become common in the small world. Diseases that might affect 1 child in 100,000 outside will quietly concentrate and wait, and when 2 carriers find each other, which in a world of repeating surnames and cousin marriages is not unlikely at all, the result is a baby that cries once and then goes silent, or a baby that smells of burnt sugar by the 4th day, or a baby born with a chest pressed inward and 6 fingers on one hand, and a heart that is already deciding whether to continue. That is the answer to what happens to Amish children born with the wrong genes. They are born, and they are loved, fiercely, with a completeness I have not seen anywhere outside that world. And then they are buried, because the door to the knowledge that could have saved them was closed. And it was closed long before I arrived at the bedside with my basin and my cloths. And for 22 years I helped keep it closed. And the first baby was a girl born in February 1989. On a night when the wood smoke in the farmhouse off Groffdale Road was so thick I could taste it. And her mother was 19 and strong, and the labor was easy, and the baby came out pink and screaming, and I handed her to her grandmother and went home and slept. And by the third day she was yellow, and by the seventh day she was the color of the wheat fields in August. And the yellow was in the whites of her eyes, and I told her father, a boy of 22, still soft-looking, still with his wedding beard coming in uneven, I told him she needed to go to the hospital in Lancaster, and he listened, and he nodded, and he went into the kitchen with his own father and his uncle and the bishop who had been called, and when he came back, he said they would pray on it. And they prayed, and she did not go to the hospital, and she lived for 9 months, and by the end she could not lift her head, and when she died on a Thursday morning, her mother had already been pregnant for 2 months, with the next one, and that next one was a girl they named Rebecca, and Rebecca is part of the rest of this story in a way that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. The second one was the boy who smelled of syrup. Spring of 1993. His mother had been my neighbor since we were small, and I knew her the way you know a person you have grown alongside. I knew her cough. I knew the way she held her shoulders when she was frightened. I knew she would not send for me until she was certain something was wrong. Which is why when her oldest daughter appeared at my door on the 4th morning after the birth, I did not stop to put on my good apron. I crossed the field at a near run, and I smelled it before I reached the cradle. Sweet, burnt, like syrup scorched in a pan, not a smell that belongs on a newborn, not a smell that belongs anywhere in a house where a baby is sleeping. I know now what that smell was. It was maple syrup urine disease, a metabolic disorder so concentrated in certain Amish communities that it appears in perhaps 1 in every 150 births in the affected settlements, against roughly 1 in 180. 000 in the wider world. That is what the founder effect does. It takes something that would be a tragedy in a city and makes it a pattern in a county. The boy was not taken to the hospital. The conversation in the kitchen lasted 3 hours. He died on the 7th day. I washed him in the basin. My neighbor and I sat at the same quilting frame for 17 more years after that, and we never once named what had happened in that cradle. And the silence between us about it was so old and so large that it had become a kind of furniture, something you walked around without looking at. The third came 6 years later, a boy with a chest that looked pressed inward and 6 fingers on his left hand, and a heart that I could hear working wrong even through the cloth I laid against his ribs. They took him to the hospital the 2nd week when his lips went blue during a feeding, and the doctors spoke about a surgery, and the family went home and prayed, and he died on a Sunday in his mother's arms. And I washed him in the same basin, and his hand with the 6 fingers was curled against his cheek, and I counted them again. I do not know why. I just did. 6, all 6 still there, small and perfect and still. The 4th was Rebecca's, the younger sister of the yellow baby. I had caught Rebecca myself in 1990 and watched her grow up and been at her wedding in 2009 to a young man from the neighboring district. And I had stood at the back of the barn when the bishop read the family lines and felt something cold move through my hands when I understood that Rebecca's great-grandmother and the young man's great-grandfather had been sister and brother, not first cousins. Closer than that, and the math was not difficult, and I felt it in my hands, but I had no language for it, and so I stood there and said nothing and smiled when people looked at me. Her first baby was fine. Her second was fine. The third was the one I was holding when the story began, the one born just after the kitchen clock struck 3 in the morning, the one who cried once and then went quiet. And who lived, I want to be careful here, she lived for 6 months as an ordinary baby, feeding and sleeping and finding her mother's face. And then in October, a fever came, and when it broke, the baby was still breathing, but the part of her that had found her mother's face was gone. She lived to be 8 years old, and she never spoke a word, but she knew her mother's voice until the very end. And Rebecca told me that later in a letter, one of the last letters she sent me before the visits stopped, and the letters stopped, and my sister wrote to say she could no longer write to me. The call I made was not against any written rule. There was no written rule. There is rarely a written rule for the things that matter most in a closed community. There is simply the understanding. Carried in the body the way you carry the memory of your first language, that some doors do not get opened, and some questions do not get asked, and some calls do not get made. I made the call anyway. I had kept the number folded in the back of a drawer for 2 years, a geneticist who had come through our settlement during an outbreak, who had given me her card and said, quietly, so that no one else could hear her, that if I ever wanted to talk, she would listen. I called her in November of 2010, standing in the phone shanty at the corner of the road, and she listened, and she came. And she brought another doctor, and they tested Rebecca's baby and Rebecca and her husband, and with permission they tested 3 other families who had buried children in our settlement in the years I had been catching babies, and the word they brought back, founder effect, was a word that rearranged everything I thought I had understood about 22 years of bedside vigils and morning funerals and singing, that was so beautiful it made the grief feel almost like a gift. It was not a gift. It was a small founding population, and the mathematics of closed marriage, and 200 years of not knowing what a carrier was. The bishop came to my kitchen a week after the doctors left. He sat at my table, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not condemn me, and he said, very quietly, "We have always handled our own." The conversation lasted less than an hour. Within 3 months, I was attending no more births. Within 6 months, I had sold my home. I took my tin basin with me when I left, and I drove 12 miles north into a rented house in an English town where I did not know anyone. And I am telling you this now because there are 4 graves in a cemetery, off a road I will not name. The yellow baby, the syrup boy, the boy with 6 fingers, the girl who knew her mother's voice. And because there is a clinic in Strasbourg that has existed for years where Amish and Mennonite children with these conditions are treated and kept alive into adulthood, and I did not know about it for most of my career, because the closed door that kept the outside world out also kept that knowledge out, and because the same founder effect that concentrated those recessive genes into that community is still concentrating them, and the mathematics does not stop just because no one is saying the word out loud. I did not leave because I stopped loving them. I want to be honest about that. The community that raised me taught me to sit at a deathbed without looking away, and that is not nothing. But I could not stay and keep the silence I had kept for 22 years, and so I left. And I took the basin, and the geranium I grow in it now is for the 4 I washed in it, and for every mother who ever looked at me across a bedroom, with eyes that already knew and waited for me to give her the words I did not have. I have the words now. What happens to Amish children born with the wrong genes is this: they are born into families who would do anything for them, into a community that will sing at their funerals with a beauty that breaks you open, and they die of diseases that are knowable, and in some cases treatable, and in some cases preventable, and the door that might have saved them stays closed, and the silence that keeps that door closed is handed from one person to the next, the way every other tradition is handed down, not with cruelty, but with certainty. And certainty does not leave room for the question, and the question is the only thing that could have helped.